Hello everyone, this video is going to be about reloading. I promised on my Facebook page that we would do a video on reloading. This will take you through what you got to have, the different steps that you go through. I do want to give a warning though that reloading is dangerous. You can get severely hurt, possibly could get killed. So if you're thinking about reloading, make sure you study up on it and you know what you're getting into, because you're dealing with explosives, you're dealing with gunpowder, you're dealing with primers, and all this can have some serious consequences if you don't know what you're doing and you don't know what your measurements are. So you've got to be very careful. We hold no responsibility for anyone who tries to reload. This is just some tips, some things I do. We take no responsibility for this. Just wanted to make that clear before the video gets started, and that everyone understands this is my reloading, my techniques. I'm not telling you what to use, what gunpowder to use, what primers to use. These are things that I use. So, just enjoy the video, and hopefully you may learn some tips from watching what I've done. I'm not an expert in no way. I'm an amateur reloader. I've done some reading, asked some questions from fellow reloaders. So, in no way am I suggesting you go out and start reloading or suggesting anything in this video. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, having a caliber for measuring your brass is a good thing to have. These aren't that expensive. Digital ones cost a little bit more. This is a Frankfurt Arsenal, and you need to have one, especially when you're going to measure your cartridge overall length. Now, I use Lee. I don't have any particular brand of reloading equipment that I like. I like the Lee because it's the least expensive. My dies are Lee. I do have some Hornady dies, some RCBS dies, but most of my dies are Lees. Now, if you don't have a set of calibers and you're wanting to get your brass sized, Lee makes what's called the shell trim length gauge. And basically this one here is for 303 British. This here is one for 9mm. And you can see the little tip on the end, that's to go through where the primer pocket is. This is for 380. I have here for 357 Magnum, 38s, 30-06, 25-06. Lee also has a cutter. And this trim length gauge, generally when you buy it, I'll show you how it comes. I ordered one for my 45 ACP. Here's your trim length gauge, and it comes with a shell holder. And that shell holder can only be used when you get the cutter. You get this, which the shell holder screws onto it. You take your piece of brass, put it in the shell holder, and you tighten this down. Okay, we've got this step already done. This is the cutter. It's threaded inside. This is the 303 British trim length gauge. And you screw that cutter onto it. You take your piece of brass, holding it in this hand, your cutter, you stick it in there, and then you turn it by hand. And if this brass was too long, it would trim it. Now, of course, this brass, when I measured it, was 2.208, so there's nothing for it to trim. Okay, so we're good there. So that brass is fine. Now, they make another tool. Let me leave that in there. Lee makes a dechamfering tool. You run that on the inside, like that. Take any burrs, you just twist it back and forth. It takes off any burrs on the inside, and then you do it on the outside. You basically just stick this brass down in it, and you just run it back and forth, and it trims all the excess burrs off, kind of just smooths it out. You do that to the inside and the out, to where that brass is nice and smooth. That way, when you go to put the bullet in, these are the bullets that I'll be using. That bullet will set on there, and then of course the press forces it down in there. And your depth is determined pretty much by this groove on the side of the bullet. If you crimped it, that's where you'd crimp is into that groove when you crimp the brass. But like I said, on a bolt action, I don't worry about crimping. Now, if you wanted to not make your hands all cramped up, because this will, doing it by hand, will cramp your hands. Take it from somebody who's been doing this for about 7 years now. They have another, Lee has another little device that you use the shell holder, and you use the shell trim length gauge, and then you get this Lee cutter. And basically it's the same cutter as I just showed you, but it's on a ball. Makes it easier to grip. But they make it's a Lee zip trim. And I'll show you what that looks like. Now you see the Lee zip trim, and I'll show you how that works. Your shell holder screws onto it, and you take your piece of brass and put it in like so. Of course, now the trim length gauge screws onto the cutter. You push it in until it comes to a stop, and you pull. If I can get this one hand out of the way. It's like trying to start a lawnmower or a weed eater. When you're done, you loosen it up, take your shell out. You can also leave the shell in, tighten it back down, make sure it's seated in there good. Take the dechamfering tool, and you have smoothed out the edges, no burrs. You have a piece of brass ready to prime, load with powder, and a bullet. Okay, we'll do a few more. Move the tray a little bit closer to where I'm working. Again, it just slides all the way in. I've done 4 so far. There's number 5. They do make a universal chuck that fits this to where you don't have to screw the shell holder on. The universal chuck will work on any brass for any caliber. Again, there's no set number of times to pull on this. You just want to take the burrs off the edge of the brass where it's smooth and take the burrs off the inside. Of course, now there's another tool, just a wire brush, that you run through there to make sure you get all the brass out, all the shavings, clean the inside of it out. I'll do the rest of these and we'll go to the next step. Okay, I'm down to the last 2. One of them have trimmed. They're all under the trim length gauge size. This is the last one. And as you can see, nice and round, trimmed, or chamfered. And of course, when you sit here and do 40 of them, if you look at your hands, you can see all the shavings. So we've got 40 rounds all trimmed up and ready for the next step. Always make sure you put the tools you're working with away when you're done with that particular task. Okay, we've got all the brass sized and cleaned. And now we want to take this brush and run it through the brass to get any residue from the trimming we've done out of the brass. Now, I only have one tray, so I'm just going to lay the brass off to the side once I've run the brush through it. And this, you have to do every one of these because you don't want anything in there mixing with your gunpowder. Now, there are expensive tools, electronic devices that have brushes that spin, and you just take your brass and run it up and down it to clean it. But I just choose to do it by hand. I mean, I don't load thousands of rounds a month for either rifle or shotgun or pistol. I load 50 rounds, 100 rounds, and then use it, load up some more. Now you can buy new brass, like this here was new brass, never been primed, and start from there, or you can start saving your own brass, or if you've got friends shoot the same caliber rifle you have, get them to save you their brass if they're not reloaders. and you can end up with a lot of brass. I've got 303 British. I've got 100 rounds of new brass and 50 rounds of once fired brass from my own shooting. So I have plenty of brass, and the brass can, if you're careful, the brass can be used over and over again. You just have to examine your brass each time. If you're not loading max charges, the casing swells whenever you fire it, and then it shrinks back down. That's the reason why you have to resize. And it will also stretch, but you can get, maybe if you use moderate powder, you can use brass 5-6 times, but you should visually inspect it for any cracks that may be appearing in the brass, separation of the head from the brass, because when it gets to that stage, that brass is no longer usable. It's dangerous. I'll continue doing this, and we'll be back with the next step.